Montana Territory, December 1881. The settlement of Bitterroot Crossing sat at 4,200 feet, where winter didn't ask permission. It took what it wanted. And what it wanted every single year was pipes. Frozen solid by January, burst by February, rebuilt by March. The cycle was as predictable as the snow itself. Every homesteader knew it. Every builder accepted it. Every winter brought the same damage, the same costs, the same resigned shrugs. Until one man's stupid mistake became the solution nobody saw coming. This is the story of how Walter Grimsby's plumbing, the installation his neighbors mocked as wasteful, backwards, and plain wrong, survived the winter that destroyed everyone else's. The winter that turned laughter into silence. The winter that proved sometimes the craziest-looking solution is the only one that works. Stay until the end, because the temperature reading that shut down the skeptics will change how you think about freeze protection forever. Hit that subscribe button and smash the like, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'll reply with a specific freeze prevention tip for your region. Let's go. Bitterroot Crossing had 47 cabins in the winter of 1880. By March, 39 of them had dealt with frozen pipes. 11 had burst lines, had structural water damage that cost more than the original plumbing installation. The standard method was simple. Dig down 18 inches, lay your pipe, hope for the best. Sometimes you wrap burlap around the iron. Sometimes you ran the line closer to the cabin foundation, gambling that radiant heat from the structure would keep things flowing. Sometimes you just accepted that when temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit, you'd be hauling buckets from the creek until spring. It wasn't incompetence. It was reality. The ground froze 30 inches deep in a normal winter. Deeper in a bad one. Digging past frost line meant breaking through hardpan and bedrock with hand tools. It meant weeks of labor for a single water line. It meant costs that most settlers simply couldn't afford. So they adapted. Morning routine included checking the pump. Evening routine included draining lines if the cold looked serious. Winter meant living with the constant threat that one hard freeze could leave you without water for months. Walter Grimsby lived this reality for 3 years. Blacksmith by trade, practical by nature, not educated, not wealthy, not connected. Just a man trying to keep his family's water running through another Montana winter. And every spring, he rebuilt something, a cracked coupling, a split section, once an entire run of pipe that had frozen, expanded, and shattered like glass. The breaking point came in March 1881. His main line froze during a late cold snap, 8 days below zero, the kind of cold that made your breath crystallize before it left your mouth. When the thaw came, the pressure blew out a joint right under his workshop floor. The water flooded his forge area, ruined a month's worth of stored charcoal, damaged 3 customer projects, cost him $17 in materials, and lost work, more than a month's income. He stood in the ankle-deep water, watching his livelihood literally drain into the ground, and made a decision. This was the last time. Walter didn't set out to revolutionize anything. He just wanted his pipes to survive one winter without costing him money he didn't have. The plan was simple. Go deeper. Get the pipe below where the frost could reach it. He'd heard miners talk about ground temperature staying stable at 4 feet down, even in January. Whether that was true or not, it had to be better than 18 inches. But here's where the mistake happened. Walter started digging in late August 1881, giving himself time before the ground froze. 4 feet down, he hit a layer of wet clay, the kind that holds water, stays cold, and would probably freeze solid even at depth. A proper plumber would have known to avoid it. Walter didn't know any better, so he kept going. 5 feet, 6 feet. At 6.5 feet, he finally broke through into drier soil with better drainage. Then came the second error. He didn't have enough straight pipe to make the run. What he had was a collection of shorter sections, odd lengths, pieces salvaged from other projects. To make it work, he had to create multiple vertical rises and drops, a snake-like pattern that looked absolutely ridiculous from above. His neighbor, Curtis Mannering, watched him work one afternoon and actually laughed out loud. You installing pipe or building a puzzle? The thing looks like a drunk man drew the plans. But Walter had accidentally created something brilliant, a thermal trap system with natural circulation breaks. The deep sections sat below frost penetration in thermally stable soil. The vertical rises created air gaps that interrupted cold transfer from the surface. The multiple elevation changes meant water couldn't sit stagnant in any one section. It had to keep moving, and moving water doesn't freeze as easily as still water. He insulated the shallow sections near the cabin with a mixture of dry sawdust and pine tar, packed into wooden channels he built around the pipe. It looked bulky and strange, like the pipe was wearing a badly fitted coat. When he finally connected everything in October, the installation looked like nothing anyone in Bitterroot Crossing had ever seen. Excessive depth, weird angles, overbuilt insulation, unnecessary complexity. Curtis stood in Walter's yard, shaking his head. You just spent 3 times the work for the same result we all get. Come February, you'll be fixing brakes just like the rest of us. Walter just tightened the last coupling and said nothing. Winter was coming. They'd all find out together. The criticism started before the first snow. November brought the usual preparation: draining lines, wrapping pipes, checking for weak points. Walter did none of it. His system was sealed, buried, and as far as he was concerned, ready. That's when people started talking. Grimsby thinks he's smarter than everyone else, someone said at the general store. Dug to China just to avoid doing what works. Curtis Mannering was more direct. Wasted a month of good weather on a hole that'll freeze, just like mine does. Depth don't matter when the whole Earth's frozen. Even Walter's wife, Sarah, had doubts. Walter, everyone else drains their lines when it gets cold. Shouldn't we at least do that? Just to be safe. But the real blow came from Edmund Carver. Carver was the closest thing Bitterroot Crossing had to a professional plumber. He worked on buildings in Denver before moving north. He'd installed systems in half the cabins in the settlement. When Carver gave an opinion on plumbing, people listened. He examined Walter's setup in early December, walking the property line where the insulation boxes were visible above ground. He crouched down, knocked on one of the wooden channels, stood up and brushed the snow off his hands. Grimsby, I've been doing this 15 years. I've seen flash-in-the-pan ideas come and go. He gestured at the bulky insulation. This is what happens when a blacksmith thinks he's an engineer. You've built a rot trap that'll be falling apart by spring, assuming the pipes inside it don't freeze first. Probably both. He said it loud enough that 3 other men heard it. By evening, the whole settlement knew. The professional had declared Walter's system a failure waiting to happen. The social judgment was worse than the technical criticism. In a frontier community, there was a certain pride in doing things the hard way, the proven way. You didn't overcomplicate. You didn't waste resources on untested theories. You did what your neighbors did. You accepted the same hardships they accepted, and you didn't act like you were above the struggle. Walter's elaborate system felt like a rejection of that ethos. Like he thought he was too good for the standard approach. Too smart for the old ways. People stopped asking him about it. When someone mentioned frozen pipes around him, the conversation would shift. The message was clear. You want to be different, fine, but don't expect sympathy when it fails. Walter kept his head down and his thoughts to himself. He'd know soon enough. Keep watching, because the numbers that came next didn't just prove him right. They humiliated the experts. January 1882 started cold and got colder. By the second week, temperatures were holding at 5 below 0 Fahrenheit during the day. At night, they dropped to -15, -18. On January 19th, the morning reading hit -23. That was cold enough to kill livestock, cold enough to crack green timber, cold enough that breathing outside felt like inhaling broken glass, and cold enough to freeze every standard water line in Bitterroot Crossing. Curtis Mannering's pump seized on January 11th. The Hutchins family lost their kitchen line on the 14th. By January 20th, 22 households were hauling water. By the 25th, it was 31. The pattern was always the same. The pump would resist, then refuse. You'd pour hot water down the line, try to thaw it. Sometimes it worked. Usually it didn't. And if you got lucky enough to thaw it, You lived in constant fear of the pressure burst that would come when ice expanded inside iron pipe that had nowhere to give. Edmund Carver made a small fortune that month doing emergency repairs. 16 service calls in 3 weeks. He'd show up with his tools, assess the damage, deliver the bad news. Needs a full replacement. Can't do it until spring thaw. You'll be hauling buckets till March. People accepted it. This was the trade-off for living in Montana territory. You wanted space, independence, clean air, and your own land? Fine. But winter extracted payment, and that payment was measured in frozen pipe and manual labor. Then someone noticed Walter's cabin. It was Sarah Hutchins who said it first, talking to her husband Robert while they hauled their 5th bucket of the morning from the creek. You notice Grimsby's still got smoke from just his chimney? No steam from heating water outside. Robert looked. She was right. Every other cabin had some variation of the same scene. Fires built outside, large pots of snow being melted, the steam rising in the bitter air. Emergency water production. Walter's property had none of that. Maybe his froze so early he already switched to buckets, Robert said. But that didn't make sense either. Nobody had seen Walter at the creek. Nobody had seen Sarah hauling water. Curtis Mannering decided to ask directly. He found Walter at his forge on January 26th, working on a repair job like it was a normal winter day. Your line freeze yet? Curtis asked. No, Walter said. No. What do you mean no? I mean it's still running. Curtis stared at him. You're telling me, in this cold, your water's still flowing? Every morning so far. That's not possible. Walter set down his hammer. Come see for yourself. They walked to the cabin. Walter opened the door, went to the kitchen pump, and worked the handle. 3 pumps. 4. Water flowed into the basin. Not a trickle, not a slow drip. A normal, steady stream. Curtis touched the water. Cold but liquid. Definitely not frozen. Ow, he said. Walter just looked at him. Guess depth does matter. Word spread fast in a settlement of 47 cabins. By January 27th, 6 different men had visited Walter's property to see the pump work. By the 28th, Edmund Carver himself showed up, skeptical and visibly annoyed. Show me, he said. Walter led him inside. Work the pump. Water flowed. Carver felt the temperature of the basin, checked the pipe connections for any sign of recent thawing work, examined everything he could see for evidence of tricks or temporary fixes. There were none. How deep did you actually go? Carver asked. 6.5 feet at the deepest point. That's insane. You're telling me you hand-dug 6.5 feet of trench? Didn't have money to pay someone else to do it. Carver stepped outside and paced the property line, following the visible path of Walter's installation. He stopped at one of the insulation boxes, the bulky wooden channels he'd mocked 2 months earlier. He knelt down, brushed away snow, touched the wood. It was dry. No rot. No ice buildup. No sign of the failure he'd predicted. He stood up slowly. What's the temperature right now? Walter checked the thermometer mounted outside his workshop. -19. And you're telling me that at -19 degrees, with the ground frozen 30+ inches deep everywhere else in this valley, your pipes are still liquid? Yes. Carver was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that must have cost him considerable pride. I need to understand how this works. Over the next hour, Walter explained the system. The depth, below the frost line, into thermally stable soil that held a constant temperature even in extreme cold. The vertical rises that created natural circulation and prevented stagnant water. The insulation method that stopped heat loss in the shallow sections near the cabin. Carver listened, asked questions, did mental calculations. The differential alone. He muttered, at 6 feet down, you're probably sitting at 40 to 45 degrees, even with surface temperatures in the -20s. That's a 60-degree buffer. I didn't know the exact numbers, Walter admitted. I just knew deeper had to be warmer. It's not just depth. It's the whole system. The angles, the drainage. Even that insulation I called a rot trap. It's actually working because you built ventilation into it. You created a thermal envelope. He looked at Walter with something between respect and frustration. You stumbled into engineering principles that most trained plumbers don't even think about. But the real proof came when they started comparing numbers across the settlement. Curtis Mannering's line had frozen on January 11th at -8 degrees. 18-inch depth, standard installation. He'd spent 6 days hauling water before paying for a temporary thaw solution that lasted 3 days before freezing again. The Hutchins family had frozen at -6 degrees. 20-inch depth, burlap wrap pipe. They'd been hauling buckets for 2 weeks straight. Edmund Carver's own cabin, which he'd installed himself using professional methods, had frozen at -12 degrees. 24-inch depth, insulated coupling. Even the expert couldn't beat the cold. Walter's system was still flowing at -23 degrees and dropping. The math was brutal and simple. His installation was surviving temperatures that had defeated every other system in the valley by a margin of 11 to 17 degrees. In frontier terms, that wasn't just better. It was the difference between having water and not having water for 3 months of the year. The cost comparison was even more striking. Curtis had spent $14 on repairs and replacement parts over the past 3 winters. The Hutchins family had spent $19. Edmund Carver had spent $12 on his own cabin and made another $63 installing and repairing systems for others. Walter had spent 1 month of hard labor and $0 on repairs. By February 1st, when temperatures finally started climbing back above zero, Walter's pipes had operated continuously for 28 straight days through the coldest January in Bitterroot Crossing's recorded history. Not a single freeze, not a single burst, not a single hour of hauling buckets. The settlement's collective water bill for that month, in lost work time, repair costs, and emergency measures, exceeded $400. Walter's bill was zero. The numbers didn't lie. The system that looked stupid, wasteful, and wrong had outperformed every professional installation in the valley by a margin that couldn't be argued away or dismissed. The shift in attitude wasn't immediate, but it was total. Curtis Mannering was the first to ask for help. In March, as soon as the ground thawed enough to work, he showed up at Walter's forge with a simple request. "Walk me through it. I want to rebuild mine the right way." Walter did. They spent 2 days laying out the route, calculating depth, planning the vertical sections. Curtis did the digging himself, but he followed Walter's method exactly. By April, he had a system that mirrored Walter's principles: deep burial, thermal mass, circulation breaks, proper insulation. The next winter, Curtis's pipes ran straight through January without a single freeze. The Hutchins family rebuilt in May. Edmund Carver, after considerable thought, redesigned his own system in June and started offering the new method to clients. By August 1882, 11 households in Bitterroot Crossing had either rebuilt or were actively planning to rebuild using Walter's approach. Not all of them went to 6.5 feet. Some stopped at 5. Some used different insulation materials: sheep's wool instead of sawdust, clay instead of pine tar. Some created variations on the vertical rise pattern based on their specific terrain. But they all adopted the core principle: get below the frost line, create thermal stability, and protect what you can't bury. By the winter of 1883, 19 cabins in Bitterroot Crossing had deep burial systems. By 1885, it was 32. The method became known locally as Grimsby's fold, a reference to the folded, snake-like pattern of Walter's original installation. The technique spread beyond the settlement. Travelers and traders carried stories of the blacksmith whose weird plumbing survived when everyone else's failed. Other communities in Montana Territory started experimenting with deeper burial. Some succeeded. Some failed because they missed the details, the drainage, the circulation, the insulation strategy. But the ones who understood the full system reported the same results Walter had seen: dramatic reduction in freeze damage, elimination of seasonal water hauling, and long-term cost savings that paid back the initial labor investment within 2 winters. Edmund Carver, to his credit, became one of the technique's biggest advocates. He refined the engineering, formalized the measurements, and taught the method to other builders. In his later writings, he kept detailed journals of his work. He noted, "I dismissed Grimsby's installation as the work of an amateur who didn't understand the fundamentals." The truth was the opposite. He understood them better than I did, because he'd been forced to think past convention to survive. The principle Walter had stumbled into wasn't new. It was physics, thermal mass, geothermal stability. The Earth below a certain depth maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round, cooler than summer air, warmer than winter air. Get your infrastructure into that zone, and you're no longer fighting the seasons. You're working with the planet's natural thermal regulation. Frontier builders had known this instinctively for generations. Root cellars used the same principle. So did dugout cabins, sod houses, and ice storage pits. But somehow, when it came to water lines, the conventional wisdom had settled on shallow installation as good enough. It took a blacksmith with no formal training and no choice but to try something different to prove that good enough was leaving performance on the table. Today, modern building codes in cold climates require water lines to be buried below the frost line, typically 3 to 4 feet in northern regions, deeper in extreme climates. Insulation is standard. Thermal breaks are engineered into the system design. The principles Walter worked out through trial, error, and desperation are now baseline requirements taught in every plumbing certification course. But he didn't know he was pioneering anything. He just wanted his pipes to survive the winter without costing him money he couldn't afford to lose. Sometimes the best solutions don't come from experts working at the cutting edge. They come from ordinary people who can't afford to fail, who don't have the luxury of accepting conventional limitations, and who are willing to dig a little deeper, literally and figuratively, to find what actually works. Walter Grimsby's legacy isn't a monument or a building. It's 19 households in Bitterroot Crossing that stopped hauling buckets in January. It's a technique that's spread across Montana territory and beyond. It's a reminder that engineering isn't always about formal education or professional credentials. Sometimes it's just about paying attention to what the problem is actually asking for, instead of what everyone else says the answer should be. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever survived? Hit subscribe for weekly deep dives into frontier engineering that actually worked when people's lives depended on it. These weren't just old tricks. They were solutions that modern builders are still learning from today. See you in the next one. Educational note. This script presents historical reconstruction based on plausible frontier engineering principles. Thermal mass, frost line burial, and insulation strategies are real physics principles. Any modern plumbing work should follow current local building codes and professional engineering standards. This content is educational and historical in nature, not a substitute for professional consultation.